What if the stories we call myths were never stories at all? What if, buried beneath the poetry and the divine names, beneath the gods and the monsters, there lies something older, something closer to record than to religion? Tonight, we ask a question that pulls at the thread of everything we think we know about our beginnings. What if the moon's oldest myths are not fantasies spun by fearful ancestors around dying fires, but observations, precise, deliberate, scientific, made by a people who watched the sky with a clarity we have only recently reclaimed? The moon hangs there, cold and silent, reflecting light it does not make. For as long as humans have lifted their eyes, it has been there. We have walked on it. We have mapped its craters and measured its pull on our tides. But long before Neil Armstrong's boot pressed into that gray dust, long before Galileo turned his lens toward those ancient seas, there were others who watched. And they did not simply watch. They recorded. If you are drawn to the kind of history that sleeps between myth and archaeology, that hides in the margins of what we are told is settled, then stay. Like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments below where you are listening from tonight. Are you lying in bed? The glow of the screen the only light? Are you driving through darkness, alone with your thoughts? Wherever you are not alone in this question. We are all inheritors of a memory we have not yet fully recovered. The moon does not speak, but the stories do. And when you gather them, when you pull the lunar myths from Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica, from the islands of the Pacific and the plains of North America, from the Nile and the Indus and the caves of Europe, a pattern begins to emerge. Not a vague pattern, not the soft glow of coincidence, but something sharp, something that cuts through time like a blade. Consider this. The Babylonians, around 4,000 years ago, possessed lunar calendars of extraordinary precision. They could predict eclipses. They knew the Saros cycle, the 18-year, 11-day rhythm by which eclipses repeat. They marked it. They used it. And we have praised them for this knowledge, called them the dawn of astronomy, the first stargazers. But here is the unsettling part. The precision they had did not emerge from their civilization. It was already there when their records begin. They inherited it. From whom? The Sumerians before them knew the moon's phases to the day. Their calendar was lunisolar, balanced between the orbit of the moon and the turn of the earth around the sun. A feat requiring centuries of observation, or so we assume. But when we read their oldest texts, there is no experimentation. There is no trial. There is only knowledge delivered whole. And in those texts there are beings Anunnaki they are called who descend and teach. Teach what? The heavens, the cycles, the counting of time itself. Now step outside Mesopotamia. Travel east to the Indus Valley. There, in the Vedic hymns, some of the oldest religious poetry we possess, the moon is called Soma, and it is tracked with ritual precision. The hymns describe its waxing and waning, its union with certain stars, its phases tied to sacrifice and ceremony. The language is devotional, yes, but beneath the devotion is data. The Rig Veda, composed perhaps 3,500 years ago, or older still, describes lunar eclipses and the nodes, the points where the moon's orbit crosses the plane of Earth's orbit, with a clarity that implies long, sustained observation. Who observed? For how long? Crossed the Pacific. In Polynesia, navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using the stars and the moon. They did not write. They carried their knowledge in chant, in ritual, in the careful training of memory. And yet they knew. They knew the rising and setting points of the moon across the year. They knew how its light changed the behavior of fish, the flow of currents. They used it to time voyages to predict weather. When European sailors arrived with sextants and charts, they found a people who had been reading the sky for so long that no one could say when it began. Only that it had always been known. Move west to the Americas. The Maya, whose calendar is famous, whose long count stretches back to a mythical beginning in 3114 BCE, were obsessed with the moon. They tracked its synodic month, the time from new moon to new moon, with an error margin of mere seconds per year. They knew the lunar eclipse cycle. They carved it into stone. And in their myths, the moon is not simply a light in the sky. It is a teacher, a keeper of cycles, a marker of time that predates even the gods themselves. The Popol Vuh speaks of ages before this age, worlds that existed and were destroyed. And in those worlds, the moon was already there, already counted. These are not primitive peoples guessing at lights in the dark. These are cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, who possessed knowledge of the moon that should not exist without long, unbroken chains of observation. And yet, when we trace those chains backward, they do not fade into ignorance. They fade into myth, into stories of teachers and sky watchers and beings who came before, beings who showed them how to see. So we must ask, were the myths invented to explain what they saw? Or were they remembering something older, something that saw first and taught them to see? Let us begin with what we think we know. We are told that agriculture arose around 12,000 years ago, give or take. That settlements formed. That writing emerged 5,000 years ago in Sumer, in Egypt. That before this there were only hunter-gatherers, small, mobile, proliterate, their lives governed by survival, not the stars. We are told that the study of the heavens came later, after surplus, after cities, after priests had time to gaze upward and wonder. This is the narrative. This is the line we draw through time. But the moon does not respect our lines. The myths do not respect them. And when we examine them closely, not as stories but as documents, the line begins to blur. Take the Metonic cycle. This is the period of 19 solar years, after which the phases of the moon return to the same dates. It is a cornerstone of lunisolar calendars, the kind used by the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Chinese, the Hebrews. To discover this cycle requires meticulous observation over decades, perhaps centuries. The Greeks credited Meton of Athens with its discovery in 432 BCE. But the Babylonians knew it earlier, much earlier. And there is evidence, fragmentary yes but persistent, that others knew it earlier still. In Ireland, at Newgrange, there is a passage tomb older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge. It was built around 3200 BCE. Its entrance is aligned to the winter solstice sunrise. But recent studies of its architecture suggest something more. The corbelled roof, the spirals carved into the stone, the layout of surrounding monuments. There are arguments, compelling ones, that the site encodes lunar cycles. Not just the solstice, not just the sun, the moon, the 18.6-year cycle of lunar standstills, the extremes of the moon's rising and setting points. If this is true, and the debate is fierce, then the builders of Newgrange were tracking the moon with a sophistication that predates anything we credit the Babylonians with. And they did it without writing, without cities, without what we call civilization. Or did they? Perhaps the absence of writing is not the absence of knowledge. Perhaps writing is simply one way to store what has already been learned. And if the learning came first, long before the stylus pressed into clay, then the question becomes, how was it passed down? And who passed it? The myths say teachers. The myths across the world speak of figures who descend, who arrive, who instruct. In Mesopotamia, they are the Apkallu, the 7 sages who came before the flood and taught humanity the arts of civilization, including the measuring of time. In Greece, they are figures like Prometheus, who brought fire and knowledge. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who taught astronomy and agriculture. In India, the Saptarishi, the 7 sages, who composed the hymns and preserved the Vedas. In Egypt, Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing and the moon, who measures the days and records the stars. These are not myths of invention. They are myths of transmission. Someone knew, someone taught, and the myths remember. Now consider the eclipse. A total lunar eclipse, when the Earth passes directly between the sun and the moon, casting its shadow across that pale face, turning it red. To ancient peoples, this was a powerful event. Frightening, perhaps, or sacred. But it was also predictable. The Saros cycle, which we mentioned earlier, allows one to predict eclipses based on prior patterns. The Babylonians used it. So did the Chinese. And so, it seems, did others. In the Mayan Dresden Codex, one of the few pre-Columbian books to survive, there is an eclipse table. It lists dates and intervals, predicting lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy. The codex itself dates to the 11th or 12th century CE, but the astronomical data within it is older, much older. The Maya did not invent this knowledge in the centuries before the Spanish arrived. They inherited it, refined it, carried it forward from an earlier time. How much earlier? Their long count calendar begins in 3114 BCE. Their myths speak of previous worlds, previous ages, destroyed by flood and fire. And in those ages, the moon was already being watched. And it is not only the Maya. In ancient China, oracle bone inscriptions from the Shang dynasty, dating to around 1200 BCE, record lunar eclipses. But the language used suggests prior knowledge. These are confirmations, not discoveries. And in the Rig Veda, composed perhaps a millennium earlier, there are hymns that describe Rahu, a shadow demon who swallows the moon, causing eclipses. The description is mythological, yes, but the timing is not. The verses tie the eclipses to specific stellar configurations, to the nodes, to cycles that require long observation. This is not storytelling. This is data dressed in the language of the sacred. And when we strip away the poetry, when we look at the structure beneath, we find something that should not be there. We find knowledge that predates the tools we believe were necessary to acquire it. Imagine for a moment that you are a farmer in ancient Anatolia 10,000 years ago. You do not write. You do not live in a city. But every night the moon rises, and every month it changes. And someone, perhaps an elder, perhaps a specialist in your community, has taught you to watch, to mark the days, to know when the moon will be full, when it will vanish, when it will return. This knowledge governs your planting, your hunting, your rituals. It is not abstract. It is survival. And it has been passed to you from those who came before, who learned it from those before them, stretching back into a time when there were no fields, no villages, only the sky and the knowledge it demanded. How far back does that chain go? And what lies at its beginning? There is a peculiar consistency to the lunar myths that deserves our attention. Across continents, across languages that share no common root, the moon is described not merely as a light or a deity, but as something that governs, as something that teaches, as something that must be tracked, honored, and understood. The language varies, but the function does not. The moon is a clock. The moon is a calendar. The moon is a teacher of cycles. In ancient Egypt, the god Thoth is credited with the invention of writing, mathematics, and the calendar. He is depicted with the head of an ibis, and often, he holds the scepter and the ankh. But he is also the god of the moon. His role is to measure time, to balance the scales of Ma'at, to record the deeds of the dead. The lunar calendar of Egypt was not merely religious, it was administrative. It governed festivals, agricultural cycles, the flooding of the Nile. And the precision with which it was maintained suggests a long heritage of observation. But when we trace that heritage backward, we do not find a point of origin. We find only older references, older texts, older assumptions of knowledge already present. The pyramid texts, among the oldest religious writings in the world, dating to around 2400 BCE, contain spells and rituals tied to lunar phases. They describe the deceased king's journey through the Duat, the underworld, which is itself structured like a calendar. A journey of days and nights that mirrors the moon's waxing and waning. The knowledge is assumed. It is not explained. It simply is. In the ancient Near East, the moon was not merely tracked, it was worshipped. The city of Uar in Sumer was dedicated to Nana, the moon god, later called Sin by the Akkadians and Babylonians. The ziggurats were temples to the sky, structures oriented to celestial events. And the priesthood that served there were not only religious figures, they were astronomers. They kept records. They predicted eclipses. They marked the equinoxes and solstices. And they did this, we are told, for thousands of years. But where did their knowledge originate? The answer, according to their own records, is the Apkallu, the 7 sages who came before the flood. These were not gods. They were something else. Beings of wisdom, sent by Enki, the god of water and knowledge, to teach humanity. And what did they teach? Among other things, they taught the observation of the heavens, the measurement of time, the construction of temples aligned to celestial events. This is not mythology in the sense of fantasy. This is mythology as history, as memory encoded in narrative. And the flood itself, this is another thread. The flood myths are nearly universal. Mesopotamia, Greece, India, China, the Americas, Australia. Cultures across the world tell of a great deluge, a catastrophic flood that destroyed the world and forced humanity to begin again. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood is sent by the gods, but one man, Utnapishtim, is warned. He builds a boat. He survives. And when the waters recede, he is granted immortality and becomes the keeper of ancient knowledge. In the Bible, it is Noah. In India, it is Manu. In Greece, Deucalion. In the Americas, various culture heroes who survive the waters and teach the survivors. What if the flood was real? Not a global inundation, perhaps, but a catastrophic event or series of events, severe enough to be remembered across cultures. Sea level rise at the end of the last ice age submerged coastlines where humans lived. Entire landscapes disappeared beneath the waves. And with them, potentially, entire cultures. If a coastal civilization existed, one with knowledge of astronomy, of agriculture, of architecture, and if that civilization was destroyed by rising waters, then the survivors would carry fragments. Fragments of knowledge. Fragments of technique. And they would tell stories of what was lost, of teachers who came before, of a time when the sky was watched and the moon was understood. This is speculation, yes, but it is not baseless. The myths are too consistent. The knowledge is too advanced. And the timeline is too compressed. We are told that astronomy begins with the Babylonians, but their astronomy is already mature when their records begin. We are told that the megalithic monuments of Europe, Stonehenge, Karnak, the Orkney temples, were built by simple farmers, but the alignments are too precise, the geometry too sophisticated. We are told that the Maya calculated the solar year to within seconds, but they did it without metal tools, without the wheel, without telescopes. How? The answer we are given is, they were smart. They observed over centuries. They passed the knowledge down. And this is true. But it does not address the origin. It does not explain the apparent sudden appearance of complex systems. It does not account for the myths that insist, again and again, that the knowledge was taught. Look at the moon tonight. Look at how it moves across the sky, how its face changes night by night. You know it will return. You know the cycle. You learned this perhaps in school. Or you absorbed it simply by living, by watching. But imagine you did not know. Imagine you had to figure it out from scratch. How long would it take? How many generations of careful watching, of marking, of testing predictions against reality? Now imagine someone showed you. Someone who already knew. Someone who said, the moon waxes for 14 days, then wanes for 14. After 29.5 days it returns. And every 18 years and 11 days, the eclipses repeat. Imagine that knowledge handed to you whole. You would not need to discover it. You would only need to remember. This is what the myths describe. Not discovery. Remembrance. Not invention. Restoration of what was before. The moon's phases are not random. They are the product of geometry, Earth, Moon, Sun, locked in orbital dance. The synodic month, the time from new moon to new moon, is approximately 29.5 days. The sidereal month, the time it takes the moon to return to the same position relative to the stars, is approximately 27.3 days. The difference between these two cycles is subtle but critical. Understanding it requires sustained observation and mathematical thinking. And yet, cultures across the ancient world understood it. They used it. They built calendars around it. The Hebrew calendar is lunisolar. It adds a leap month 7 times every 19 years to keep the lunar months aligned with the solar year. This is the Metonic cycle which we mentioned earlier. The calendar itself, in its current form, dates to the early centuries CE, but the underlying structure is far older, rooted in Babylonian methods. And the Babylonians, in turn, inherited it from the Sumerians. And the Sumerians? Their earliest texts do not describe the process of learning. They describe the application. They already knew. In China, the lunar calendar has been in continuous use for thousands of years. The oldest surviving written records from the Shang dynasty, around 1200 BCE, already display a mature understanding of lunar and solar cycles. But archaeological evidence suggests that lunar observation predates writing there by millennia. Neolithic cultures in China aligned their settlements and burials to celestial events. They tracked the solstices and the moon's phases. And they did this not in isolation, but as part of a coherent cosmology, a worldview in which the heavens and earth were reflections of one another. This idea, the correspondence between heaven and earth, the microcosm and macrocosm, is not unique to China. It appears in Egypt, in the concept of Ma'at, cosmic order mirrored in earthly justice. It appears in India in the Vedic concept of Rita, the cosmic law. It appears in Greece in the Hermetic principle as above, so below. These are not primitive superstitions. They are philosophical frameworks built on observation, on the recognition that the patterns of the sky are regular, predictable, and therefore meaningful. And the moon, because it is visible, because it changes, because its cycles are short enough to witness within a human lifetime, becomes the central mechanism of this order. But here is where the unsettling part deepens. These frameworks do not develop in isolation. They appear in roughly the same period between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago, in cultures that we believe had no contact. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE disrupts much of this continuity in the Mediterranean and Near East, but the knowledge persists. It is preserved in priestly schools, in oral traditions, in the careful training of scribes and astronomers. And when we read their records, they do not speak of recent innovations. They speak of ancient wisdom, wisdom from before. The Greek philosopher Plato, in his dialogue Timaeus, describes the cosmos as a living, rational being, created by a divine craftsman, the demiurge. The cosmos is ordered by mathematical ratios, by harmonies. The planets, including the moon, move in perfect circles, governed by reason. This is philosophy, yes, but it is also astronomy. Plato's academy trained mathematicians and astronomers, and much of their knowledge came from Egypt and Babylon, where the priestly schools had kept records for centuries, perhaps millennia. Plato himself claims, through his character Critias, that Egyptian priests told the Greeks their own history was young, that the Greeks were children compared to the depth of Egyptian memory. And the Egyptians, in turn, attributed their wisdom to the gods, to Thoth, to Osiris, to those who came before. This is a pattern. Knowledge flows backward, not forward. Each culture claims to have received it from an earlier source. And when we follow those sources, we do not arrive at a moment of invention. We arrive at myth, at the story of teachers, of sages, of those who knew. Consider the concept of the lunar nodes, the 2 points where the moon's orbit crosses the ecliptic. The plane of Earth's orbit around the sun eclipses can only occur when the sun, Earth, and moon align near these nodes. The nodes themselves move slowly over an 18.6-year cycle. This is called the lunar nodal cycle, and understanding it is essential for predicting eclipses. The Babylonians knew it. The Vedic astronomers knew it. They called the nodes Rahu and Ketu and personified them as demons. The Chinese knew it. They called it the dragon's head and tail. The Maya knew it. How did they all know? Did each culture discover it independently? It is possible. Parallel development is a recognized phenomenon. But the language, the imagery, the ritual surrounding this knowledge is so similar. The nodes are consistently described as adversarial, as forces of darkness or disruption. The eclipses they cause are seen as dangerous, as times when the natural order is temporarily broken. And the response in each culture is to predict, to prepare, to perform rituals that restore balance. This is not superstition. This is applied astronomy dressed in the language of myth. And then there is the question of lunar standstills. Every 18.6 years, the moon's rising and setting points reach their maximum and minimum declinations, their furthest north and south on the horizon. This is a subtle phenomenon, far less obvious than an eclipse. Yet monuments across the ancient world appear to be aligned to it. Newgrange in Ireland, Callanish in Scotland, Chimney Rock in Colorado, the Great Hopewell Road in Ohio. These are Neolithic and early Bronze Age structures, built by people we believe were preliterate, pre-urban, pre-scientific. And yet the alignments are there, not approximate, precise. If these alignments are intentional, and the evidence increasingly suggests they are, then the builders were tracking the moon with extraordinary care. Not just the phases, not just the eclipses, but the long cycles, the ones that require generations to observe fully. Why? For what purpose? We do not know. The builders left no written records, but they left stone, and the stone speaks. Let us turn now to the Pacific, to Polynesia, where the ocean is vast and the islands are small, scattered across millions of square miles of water. To navigate this emptiness without instruments, without maps, without compasses, required a knowledge of the sky so deep, so precise, that it boggles the modern mind. The Polynesian wayfinders used the stars, yes, but they also used the moon. The moon, because it rises and sets at different points along the horizon throughout the month, provides a kind of calendar compass. By knowing the moon's phase and its position relative to certain stars, a navigator could determine direction, time of night, even the season, the swells of the ocean, the flight paths of birds, the color of the water. All these were read in conjunction with the sky, and the knowledge was not written down. Could not be. It was carried in the mind, taught through chant and ritual, preserved in the oral traditions of the navigators' guilds. When European explorers first encountered Polynesian navigators, they were astonished. Captain James Cook, in the 18th century, recorded the voyages of Tapaya, a Tahitian priest and navigator, who could name over 100 islands and describe their positions relative to Tahiti without ever having seen a map. Tapaya could navigate by the stars and the moon with an accuracy that rivaled, and in some cases exceeded, European instruments. And he was not unique. This knowledge was widespread, ancient, and unbroken. But here is the question: where did it come from? The conventional answer is that it developed over centuries of trial and error, of voyages out into the unknown, of gradual accumulation. And this is certainly part of the truth. But the Polynesian myths speak of something else. They speak of navigators who came from the west, from distant lands, who brought the knowledge of the stars and the sea. They speak of the homeland, Hawaii, a place lost in the mists of time, from which the ancestors voyaged. And they speak of the moon as a guide, a companion, a keeper of time. The Maori of New Zealand have a lunar calendar, the Maramataka, which governs planting, fishing, and ritual. Each night of the lunar month has a name, and each name carries specific knowledge about the tides, about the behavior of fish, about the weather. This is not superstition. This is environmental science encoded in tradition. And it is old. Older than the written records the Europeans brought. Older, perhaps, than the settlement of New Zealand itself, which occurred around 700 years ago. The knowledge came with the settlers, carried from the Central Pacific. And before that, from where? The trail goes cold in the deep Pacific in the time before the Great Migrations. But the myths do not stop. They continue to speak of teachers, of ancestors, of those who knew the sky. And the moon is always there, central to the story. Now cross the Pacific again eastward to the Americas, to the high deserts of the American Southwest, where the ancestral Puebloans built their cliff dwellings and their great houses. At Chaco Canyon, in New Mexico, there are structures aligned to the solstices and equinoxes. But there is also evidence of lunar alignment. The Sun Dagger, a famous petroglyph site on Fajada Butte, marks not only the solar cycles but also the lunar standstills. The light of the sun and moon passes through carefully placed stone slabs, casting shadows and beams onto spiral petroglyphs carved into the rock. The effect is dramatic, precise, and intentional. And it was created around 1,000 years ago by a culture that left no written records. Who taught them? The answer we are given is no one. They learned by watching, by experimenting, by building and rebuilding over generations. And this is plausible. But when we look at the sophistication of the alignments, when we see the same knowledge, lunar standstills, eclipse cycles, phase tracking appearing in Ireland, in Egypt, in the Pacific, in the Americas, the question nags: is this all parallel development? Is it coincidence that cultures separated by oceans and millennia all focused on the same celestial details, all encoded them in stone and myth? Or is there a deeper thread, a shared heritage older than any of these individual cultures? A time when the knowledge was more widespread, before it was fragmented by catastrophe or migration or time. The myths say yes. The myths insist on it. They speak of a golden age, a time before the flood, before the fall, before the forgetting. They speak of teachers who came and showed the way. and they speak of the moon as central to that teaching, as the first clock, the first calendar, the first window into the mechanics of the cosmos. We have a tendency, in modern thought, to dismiss these myths as primitive explanations for natural phenomena. We say, ancient peoples did not understand the moon, so they invented gods and stories. But what if it is the opposite? What if the stories came first as records, as teaching tools, as ways to preserve knowledge in the absence of writing? What if the gods are not explanations but memories, personifications of real teachers, real knowledge-bearers, whose names and deeds have been mythologized but whose teachings remain? This is not a new idea. Scholars of myth, from Mircea Eliade to Joseph Campbell, have argued that myths serve as vessels of cultural memory, encoding deep truths about human experience. But what if some myths encode something more specific, not just psychological or spiritual truths but technical ones? What if the story of Thoth teaching the Egyptians to measure time is a memory of actual instruction? What if the Polynesian navigators' tales of ancestors from Hawaii reflect real migrations from a real place, now lost? We cannot know. Not with certainty. The evidence is fragmentary, the timeline compressed, the records incomplete. But the pattern is there. The global focus on the moon, the sophisticated knowledge appearing suddenly, fully formed, the myths of teachers and lost ages. It all points to something we have not fully acknowledged, that the history we tell ourselves, the neat progression from ignorance to knowledge, may be incomplete, that there may be chapters missing, chapters written not in clay or ink, but in stone and star and story. The moon does not change, not in any meaningful human timescale. It has looked the same for thousands of years, perhaps millions. Its craters, its Maria, the patterns of light and shadow that form the face we see. All of this has been constant. And so, any human who has looked up has seen what we see now. The same phases, the same motion, the same dance with the sun. This means that the knowledge available to ancient observers is, in principle, the same knowledge available to us. They had the same sky, the same moon. What they lacked, we assume, was the framework, the mathematics, the theory, the instruments. But did they? Mathematics is older than we often credit. The Ishango bone, found in the Democratic Republic of Congo, is a small piece of bone with notches carved into it, dated to around 20,000 years ago. Some researchers believe it is a lunar calendar, the notches marking the days of the moon's phases. If true, this would make it the oldest known mathematical artifact, older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than any permanent settlement. A simple tally, yes, but a tally of what? Of the moon, of time, a pattern. The Lubombo bone from South Africa is even older, around 43,000 years. 2 has notches, 29 of them, the length of a lunar month. Again, this is contested. Some say the notches are random or decorative, but the number is too precise. 29. Not 25, not 30, 29. The same number that governs the moon's synodic cycle. Coincidence? Perhaps, but perhaps not. If humans were marking lunar cycles 40,000 years ago, then the knowledge is not 5,000 years old. It is not even 10,000 years old. It is Ice Age knowledge. Knowledge that predates everything we call civilization. And if it was being marked, it was being watched. And if it was being watched, it was being understood. Not in the way we understand it now, with equations and models, but practically, intimately, as a part of life. The Neolithic cultures that built the great stone circles and passage tombs across Europe and the Near East were not wandering bands of simple farmers. They were organized, capable of massive engineering projects requiring coordination, planning, and specialized knowledge. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey is perhaps the most striking example. Built around 11,000 years ago, it predates agriculture in that region. It consists of massive stone pillars arranged in circles, carved with animals and symbols. It required hundreds, perhaps thousands, of workers. It required planning. It required knowledge. And recent analysis of the site suggests astronomical alignments, including to the moon. Who built it? We do not know. They left no writing, but they left the stones. And the stones tell us that they were not primitive. They were sophisticated. They watched the sky, and they encoded what they saw. This is the unsettling truth we are circling. That sophistication, that knowledge, that careful observation of the cosmos, did not begin with Sumer or Egypt. It began earlier, much earlier, and it was more widespread than we have acknowledged. The megalithic cultures of Europe, the Neolithic peoples of the Near East, the pre-Columbian cultures of the Americas, they were all watching the sky. And the moon, because it is close, because it changes, because it cycles our human scale, was the focus. But why? Why invest so much effort in tracking the moon? The standard answer is agriculture. Knowing the seasons. Knowing when to plant. But lunar cycles do not align neatly with the agricultural calendar. The solar year is what matters for planting. The moon's phases are more useful for short-term tracking of tides, of animal behavior, of monthly cycles. So why the obsession? One answer is ritual. The moon governs tides, and tides affect coastal life. The moon's light affects nocturnal animals, predators, and prey alike. For a hunting-gathering culture, knowing the moon's phase could mean the difference between a successful hunt and an empty belly. And so, tracking the moon becomes survival. And survival knowledge becomes sacred. It becomes ritual. It becomes myth. But there is another answer. One that the myths themselves suggest. The moon was tracked because someone taught them to track it. Because the knowledge was passed down from a time when it mattered in a different way. When it was part of a larger system of understanding, of which only fragments remain. Consider the idea of the sky teachers that appears in so many myths. Beings who descend or arrive and teach astronomy, agriculture, writing, law. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl is such a figure. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu. In Egypt, Thoth. In Greece, the Titans and the gods who preceded the Olympians. In India, the Saptarishi. These are not always gods in the sense of omnipotent creators. They are intermediaries, culture bringers, teachers. And what they teach is often tied to the heavens. What if these myths reflect a real transmission of knowledge? Not from gods, but from an earlier human culture. A culture that, for reasons we do not yet understand, possessed advanced astronomical knowledge and passed it on before disappearing. This culture need not have been global. It could have been regional, coastal perhaps, destroyed by sea level rise or catastrophe. But its knowledge, its techniques, its observations could have been transmitted to the survivors, to the nascent cultures that would become Sumer and Egypt and the Indus and the Shang. And those cultures, in turn, would encode the knowledge in their own myths, their own rituals, their own monuments. This is speculative. But it is not fantasy. The evidence exists. The alignments, the calendars, the myths, they all point to a depth of knowledge that our standard narrative does not easily accommodate. And the moon, the silent witness, hangs there still, waiting for us to ask the right questions. There is a phrase that recurs in the ancient texts, a phrase so common we have almost stopped noticing it. As it was in the beginning, the idea that the present order of things is a restoration, a return to an original state. In the Bible, the Garden of Eden. In the Vedas, the Satya Yuga, the Golden Age. In Greek myth, the reign of Kronos before Zeus overthrew him. In Chinese legend, the Age of the Yellow Emperor. These are not identical stories, but they share a structure. There was a time of perfection, of knowledge, of harmony. Then there was a fall, a catastrophe, a forgetting. And now we are in the aftermath, trying to rebuild, to remember. What if this structure is not metaphorical? What if it reflects a real historical pattern, a cycle of rise and fall of knowledge? Gained and lost? The moon, in this framework, becomes a symbol of continuity. It does not fall. It does not forget. It simply continues, cycling through its phases, indifferent to human affairs. And so, to watch the moon, to track it, to understand it, is to connect with something permanent, something that transcends the rise and fall of civilizations. The lunar calendars used by the ancient world were not merely practical tools. They were cosmological statements. They said, we are part of this order. We are aligned with the heavens. We remember. And when a civilization fell, when its cities were abandoned and its writing forgotten, the moon remained. And the knowledge of the moon could be re-established, relearned, retransmitted. Because the evidence was always there in the sky waiting. This is why the myths speak of restoration rather than invention. The Sumerians did not invent the calendar. They restored it. The Egyptians did not invent writing. Thoth taught it and they remembered. The Maya did not calculate the solar year from scratch. They inherited the knowledge from those who came before, who remembered. This is not to diminish their achievements. It is to place them in a longer context, a deeper history. They were the inheritors, the preservers, the refiners. But they were not the first. And if they were not the first, then who was? This is the question we cannot answer. Not yet. The archaeological record is incomplete. Much of the coastline where humans lived during the Ice Age is now underwater. The settlements, the monuments, the records, if they existed, are drowned. We are looking at the survivors, the inland cultures, the ones that adapted and continued. But we are not seeing the whole picture. We are seeing the epilogue to a story whose earlier chapters are missing. The myths fill that gap. They insist that there was a before. They name it. They describe it. They mourn it. And they preserve the knowledge that came from it. The knowledge of the moon is one piece of that preservation. Not the only piece, but a central one. Because the moon is visible. Because it is trackable. Because it does not require writing or instruments to observe. It requires only patience. And memory. Consider how memory works. Not individual memory, but cultural memory. A people can forget many things, languages, technologies, histories. But they do not easily forget the sky. The sky is always there. And if the knowledge of the sky is tied to survival, to ritual, to identity, then it persists. It is passed from elder to child, from priest to initiate, from navigator to apprentice. And even if the details blur, even if the reasons are forgotten, the practice continues. The watching continues. And one day someone writes it down. And we call that the beginning. But it is not. It is only the moment when the oral became written, when the invisible became visible to us. The Dogon people of Mali, in West Africa, have an oral tradition that includes detailed knowledge of the star Sirius. They describe Sirius as a binary system, with a small, dense companion star that orbits it every 50 years. This companion, Sirius B, was not confirmed by Western astronomy until the mid-20th century, when telescopes became powerful enough to detect it. The Dogon knew. How? The conventional explanation is that they learned it from European visitors in the early 20th century. But the Dogon claim the knowledge is ancient, part of their cosmology, taught to them by beings called the Namo, who came from the sky. This is dismissed as myth. But the knowledge is real. The question is not whether they knew. The question is how. Perhaps they were taught by Westerners and the story is a recent invention. Or perhaps their oral tradition is older than we credit, and they observed or were taught long ago. We do not know. But the pattern is familiar. Knowledge that seems too advanced for the context. A myth of teachers. A focus on the heavens. This is the same pattern we see with the moon myths. The moon itself is tied to Sirius in some ancient calendars. The Sothic cycle, used in Egypt, is based on the heliacal rising of Sirius, which occurs roughly once per solar year. But it is calibrated against both the solar and lunar calendars, creating a complex triple system. Why such complexity? Because the more cycles you track, the more precisely you can measure time. And precise time measurement is essential for long-term planning, for agriculture, for ritual, for navigation. And if you are trying to preserve knowledge across generations, across catastrophes, then you need a system that is robust, that can be checked against the sky itself. The sky is the ultimate backup. You can burn the books, destroy the temples, scatter the people. But the sky remains. And anyone who knows how to read it can rebuild the knowledge. This is why the myths emphasize watching. Why the gods are associated with stars and planets and the moon. They are not arbitrary symbols. They are mnemonic devices, teaching tools encoded in narrative so that they survive. Let us consider for a moment the nature of teaching. How do you pass knowledge to someone who has no frame of reference, no prior vocabulary, no tools? You begin with what is observable. You point to the sky. You say, watch. You mark the days. You show the pattern. You give it a name. And slowly, through repetition, Through ritual, the knowledge becomes embedded. It becomes second nature. This is how oral cultures transmit knowledge. Not through books, but through practice, through story, through song. The Vedic hymns are not merely religious poetry. They are mnemonic structures, designed to be memorized and recited without error. The rhythm, the repetition, the structure, all of this serves to preserve the content across generations. And the content includes astronomy, the positions of stars, the phases of the moon, the timing of rituals tied to celestial events. The same is true of the Polynesian chants, the Aboriginal songlines, the Native American oral traditions. These are not primitive substitutes for writing. They are sophisticated information systems, capable of preserving complex data over vast spans of time. And they work precisely because they are tied to the observable world. The song describes the landscape, the stars, the moon. You walk the land and sing the song, and the knowledge is reinforced. You watch the sky and recite the chant, and the pattern is confirmed. This is why the moon is so central. It is the most dynamic object in the night sky. Changes daily. It is impossible to ignore. And so, it becomes the natural focus of these teaching systems. You can forget a star's position, but you cannot forget the moon's phase. You see it every night. And if you are taught to mark it, to name it, to tie it to other events, to tides, to seasons, to rituals, then the knowledge persists. Now imagine this system operating for not just centuries, but millennia. Imagine an unbroken chain of watchers, each teaching the next, each adding their own observations, each refining the pattern. How accurate could such a system become? How much could it preserve? And if, at some point, that chain is broken by catastrophe, by migration, by war, then the knowledge does not disappear entirely. It fragments. It becomes garbled. It becomes myth. But the core remains. The watching remains. And eventually, someone begins to write it down. And we call that the beginning of astronomy. But it is not the beginning. It is the middle. Or perhaps the end of the beginning. The real beginning is lost to us, hidden in the oral traditions that predate writing, in the Ice Age camps and the Neolithic villages, in the minds of people who watched the sky because their lives depended on it. The evidence for this is circumstantial, but it is mounting. The Lascaux cave paintings in France, dated to around 17,000 years ago, include dot patterns that some researchers interpret as star maps or lunar calendars. The interpretation is disputed, but the dots are there. They were placed deliberately. They mean something, and among the painted animals and handprints there are symbols, grids, checkerboards, patterns that do not obviously represent anything in the natural world, unless they represent something abstract, something conceptual, like number, like time. The Blanchard bone, found in France and dated to around 30,000 years ago, has a series of carved marks that some believe represent a lunar calendar spanning 2¼ months. Again, the interpretation is not universally accepted. But the marks exist. And they were made by someone who had a reason, a purpose, a system. We are accustomed to thinking of Ice Age humans as struggling for survival, focused entirely on food and shelter. And certainly, survival was paramount. But humans are not merely reactive. We plan. We imagine. We seek meaning. And one of the primary ways we seek meaning is through pattern. We are pattern recognition machines. We see faces in clouds, animals in stars. And when we see a real pattern, like the moon's phases, we do not ignore it. We mark it. We name it. We build our understanding around it. And so, perhaps, the moon was the first clock not because someone decided to invent a clock, but because the moon itself imposed a pattern on human consciousness. It demanded attention. It rewarded observation. And those who observed most carefully gained an advantage, an ability to predict, to plan, to synchronize activities. And that advantage became cultural, then sacred, then mythological. This is not to say that there was a single, unified Ice Age culture tracking the moon. That is unlikely. But it is possible, perhaps probable, that multiple cultures in different regions independently began this practice. And over time, as populations grew and interacted, the knowledge spread. It was refined. It was systematized. And by the time we reach the Neolithic, the practice is already ancient. already embedded in ritual and myth, already assumed. And then, around 5,000 years ago, something happens. The knowledge begins to be written down. In Sumer, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China. Not all at once, but within a relatively short span. Why then? Why not earlier? Why not later? One answer is the development of urban centers, of surplus, of a need for record-keeping. This is the standard explanation. But another answer is that the knowledge reached a critical density. It had been accumulating orally for so long that it began to overflow the capacity of oral transmission. It needed to be externalized, preserved in a more permanent form. And writing, when it emerged, was pressed into that service. But the knowledge itself was already old. The lunar calendars, the eclipse predictions, the alignments, these were not invented by the Sumerians or the Egyptians. They were inherited. And the myths, in their own way, tell us this. They insist on it. They say, we did not discover this. We were taught. We remember. The moon governs more than light. It governs tides, the rise and fall of oceans. The gravitational pull of the moon, combined with that of the sun, creates bulges in Earth's waters. And as the Earth rotates, these bulges sweep across the coastlines, producing the tides we observe. Ancient coastal peoples would have known this intimately. Their lives depended on it. Fishing, gathering shellfish, launching boats. All of these activities are tied to the tide. And the tide is tied to the moon. But predicting the tide is not simple. It is not merely a matter of watching the moon's phase. The timing of high and low tide varies with location, with the shape of the coastline, with the depth of the water. It requires local knowledge accumulated over years. But the underlying driver is the moon. And so, any culture living near the coast, any culture that depended on the sea, would have had a powerful incentive to track the moon. Not for abstract reasons, but for survival. The shell middens, massive heaps of discarded shells, found along ancient coastlines from Europe to the Americas to the Pacific Islands, attest to the importance of shellfish in early human diets. And shellfish gathering is tide-dependent. You gather at low tide, when the rocks and sands are exposed. And so, knowing the tide means knowing the moon. And knowing the moon means tracking it, predicting it, teaching the pattern to the next generation. This is practical knowledge, not mystical. But it is also profound. Because once you begin to track the moon for practical reasons, you cannot help but notice the other patterns. The way it moves through the stars. The way its path changes over the course of the month, the year, the decade. The way eclipses occur at specific intervals. And once you notice these patterns, the questions begin. Why? How? What does it mean? And so, practical knowledge becomes theoretical. Observation becomes philosophy. And the moon becomes not just a tool but a teacher. A symbol of order, of predictability of the cosmos itself. This transition from practical to philosophical is visible in the myths. The early lunar deities are often associated with fertility, with the tides, with the monthly cycles of women's bodies. The moon is female in many traditions, associated with birth and renewal. This is not arbitrary. The lunar month is roughly the same length as the human menstrual cycle. And so, the moon becomes a symbol of the generative power of nature, of the cycles of life. But in later traditions, the moon becomes more abstract. It becomes associated with time itself, with measurement, with wisdom. Thoth in Egypt is male, a scribe and calculator. The Babylonian Sin is a judge, a keeper of oaths. The Greek Selene is beautiful but distant, driving her chariot across the night sky. The focus shifts from the immediate biological connection to the cosmic intellectual one. This shift reflects, perhaps, the transition from oral to written culture, from small-scale to complex societies. But the underlying knowledge remains the same. The moon governs cycles. And cycles are the foundation of time, of order, of understanding. Now consider the idea of the eclipse. A lunar eclipse occurs when the Earth passes between the sun and the moon, casting its shadow onto the lunar surface. The moon darkens, turns red from the refracted light of Earth's atmosphere. To ancient observers, this would have been dramatic, perhaps terrifying. The moon, the constant companion, the marker of time, suddenly vanishes or changes color. What does it mean? The myths provide an answer. The moon is being devoured, eaten by a dragon or a demon or a wolf. This is not ignorance. It is metaphor. The shadow is the devourer. And the fact that the moon always returns, always reemerges, means that the devourer can be defeated. Order can be restored. And this restoration is often tied to ritual, to noise, to prayer, to sacrifice. The people must participate. They must help the moon return. But beneath the metaphor is prediction. The Babylonians knew that eclipses followed a pattern, the Saros cycle. They could predict when the moon would be devoured and when it would return. And this prediction was not magic. It was mathematics. It was observation. It was the culmination of centuries of careful watching. And yet, the Babylonians did not present their knowledge as mere mathematics. It was embedded in the religious calendar, in the duties of the priesthood, in the omens read by the king's advisors. The eclipse was a sign, a message from the gods. But the gods in this framework are not capricious. They are regular. They follow rules. And those rules can be known. This is a profound insight, that the cosmos is rational, that it can be understood, that the same causes produce the same effects. This is the birth of science. But it is cradled in myth, in ritual, in the sacred. So when we read the myths of the moon, when we hear the stories of gods and demons and teachers from the sky, we must ask, what is being preserved here? What knowledge, what observation, what memory is encoded in these narratives? And how far back does it go? The answer increasingly seems to be very far, farther than we have been willing to admit. The moon has been watched for tens of thousands of years. The knowledge has been passed down, refined, encoded in story and stone. And when writing emerged, it captured only a snapshot, a moment in a much longer tradition. The Babylonians were not the first. The Sumerians were not the first. They were the inheritors. And before them there were others, watching, tracking, teaching, remembering. And the moon, indifferent, continues its dance. The same dance it performed when the first human looked up and wondered. The same dance it will perform long after we are gone. It is the one constant, the one witness to the entirety of human history. And if we are wise, we will learn to read the record it keeps. Not in its surface, but in the myths we have told about it. In the knowledge we have preserved, often without knowing why. The question that haunts us now is this. If the knowledge is so old, if it has been preserved for so long, then why did we forget? Why did we have to rediscover so much? Why did the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries feel like a beginning, when it was, in so many ways, a return? The answer is loss, catastrophe, the collapse of civilizations, the destruction of libraries, the burning of books, the persecution of knowledge keepers. History is not a steady upward climb. It is a cycle of rise and fall, and each fall erases something. Each recovery is incomplete. The Library of Alexandria, in Egypt, was the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world. It contained works from Greece, Egypt, Babylon, India, Persia, gathered over centuries. And it burned, not once, but multiple times over centuries of conflict and neglect. How much was lost? We do not know. We have fragments, references in other texts, hints of what was there. But the works themselves are gone. The astronomical tables, the geometrical proofs, the histories, gone. The Mayan codices, the books of the Maya written on bark paper, contained centuries of astronomical observations. Only 4 survive. The rest were burned by Spanish priests in the 16th century, who saw them as pagan and demonic. How much knowledge was lost in those fires? What observations, what calculations, what refinements of the lunar and solar calendars? We will never know. The oral traditions of indigenous peoples around the world have been systematically suppressed, by colonization, by forced conversion, by the imposition of written culture over oral. Languages have been lost. Elders have died without passing on their knowledge. The song lines, the chants, the navigation techniques, many are gone. Some are being revived, but the chain is broken. The continuity is lost. This is the tragedy of history. Not that we do not learn, but that we forget. Not that we do not discover, but that we lose what was discovered. And so, each new generation must rediscover, must rebuild, must piece together from fragments what was once whole. The Renaissance, the rebirth of learning in Europe, was named precisely because it was understood as a recovery. The scholars of the Renaissance were not inventing new knowledge. They were recovering old knowledge, translating Greek and Arabic texts, rediscovering Aristotle and Ptolemy and Euclid. They saw themselves as restoring what had been lost. And they were right. They were not the first to know these things. They were the latest to remember. And the moon, throughout all of this, remained unchanged, unchanging, a constant against which the cycles of human history played out. And those who watched the moon, the astronomers, the astrologers, the priests, the navigators, they maintained the thread. They kept the knowledge alive, even when it was fragmented, even when it was misunderstood, even when it was forbidden. The Catholic Church, during the Middle Ages, preserved much of the astronomical knowledge of the ancient world. Not because they valued it for its own sake necessarily, but because it was needed to calculate the date of Easter, which is tied to the spring equinox and the full moon. And so, the lunar calendar, the solar calendar, the careful observation of the sky, all of this continued, housed in monasteries and universities, taught to monks and scholars. The knowledge survived, even if the context changed. And then, slowly, the knowledge began to expand again. Copernicus challenged the geocentric model. Galileo observed the moon through a telescope and saw mountains and craters, not a perfect sphere. Kepler described the elliptical orbits of planets. Newton formulated the law of gravitation, explaining why the moon orbits Earth and why the tides rise and fall. The knowledge grew, refined, became more precise. But it was not new. It was a continuation, a refinement, a recovery. And here we are now in the 21st century. We have sent spacecraft to the moon. We have brought back rocks. We have measured it, mapped it, analyzed it. We know more about the moon than any previous generation. And yet, when we read the ancient myths, when we examine the ancient alignments, when we trace the ancient calendars, we find that they knew not everything, but much, more than we have given them credit for. And the question remains, how? The standard narrative says, they were smart, they observed, they learned. And this is true. But it does not explain the speed, the precision, the global distribution of the knowledge. It does not explain why cultures separated by oceans have such similar lunar myths, such similar astronomical practices. It does not explain the monuments, the alignments, the sophisticated calculations that appear, seemingly fully formed, at the dawn of written history. And so, we are left with the alternative, the unsettling possibility, that they were not the first, that there was a before, a time, a culture, a people who watched the sky and understood it, and who passed that knowledge on through myth and monument, through oral tradition and ritual, until it was finally written down and we, much later, rediscovered it and called it new. This is not to say that there was a single, advanced global civilization in the deep past. The evidence does not support that. But it does suggest networks, connections, exchanges of knowledge across greater distances and deeper time than we have traditionally assumed. It suggests that the history of science does not begin 5,000 years ago, but much earlier. And that the myths, far from being primitive fantasies, are the fossils of that earlier science, distorted, yes, but recognizable. The moon is our archive. The myths are the catalog. And we are only beginning to learn how to read them. There is a concept in archaeology called archaeoastronomy, the study of how ancient peoples understood and used astronomy. It is a relatively young field, emerging in the mid-20th century, and it has been met with skepticism. The idea that prehistoric peoples, without writing, without instruments, could have possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge seemed far-fetched to many scholars. But the evidence has been accumulating. The alignments are real. The calendars are real. The knowledge was there. One of the pivotal discoveries was at Stonehenge. For centuries, it was assumed to be a temple, a burial ground, a place of ritual whose purpose was lost. But in the 1960s, astronomers began to examine the alignments of the stones. They found that Stonehenge is aligned to the solstices, the sunrise on the summer solstice, the sunset on the winter solstice. But more than that, it appears to track the lunar standstills, the 18.6-year cycle we discussed earlier. The station stones, for markers around the perimeter, form rectangles whose sides align to the extreme rising and setting points of the moon. This was controversial. How could Neolithic builders, around 5,000 years ago, have known about lunar standstills? The cycle is long. It is subtle. It requires multi-generational observation. But the evidence is there in the stones. Either the alignment is coincidence, which, given the precision, seems unlikely, or the builders knew. And if they knew, then they must have observed. And if they observed, they must have been taught, or they must have developed the knowledge themselves over long periods. The same pattern appears at other sites. At Callanish, in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, the stone circle is aligned to the moon's southern extreme. Every 18.6 years, the moon appears to skim along the horizon, framed by the stones. A dramatic sight, visible only to those who know when to look. The builders of Callanish 5,000 years ago knew. In the Americas, at the Hopewell earthworks in Ohio, vast geometric mounds and embankments cover square miles. Recent surveys have revealed that these earthworks are aligned to the lunar standstills, with an accuracy that rivals Stonehenge. The Hopewell culture flourished around 2,000 years ago, but the earthworks suggest knowledge that extends back further, into the traditions of earlier peoples in the region. These are not isolated examples. They are part of a global pattern. From Karnak in France to Nabta Playa in Egypt, from the Chanquillo Towers in Peru to the stone alignments in Korea, there is evidence of lunar observation embedded in the landscape. And this evidence is old. Older than writing. Older than cities. It speaks to a long tradition of sky watching, of knowledge passed down through generations, encoded in stone because stone endures. But stone is not the only medium. The myths, as we have seen, are another, and perhaps the most enduring, because stone can be broken, buried, forgotten. But stories, if they are told, if they are valued, can survive almost anything. They adapt, they change, but the core remains. And the core in the lunar myths is always the same. The moon is a teacher. The moon is a clock. The moon is a connection to something older, something wiser, something that came before. This brings us back to the central question. What came before? If the knowledge is so old, if it predates the civilizations we know, then where did it originate? Was it developed independently in each region by each culture? Or was there a point of origin, a source from which the knowledge spread? The independent development model is certainly possible. The moon is visible to everyone. Any culture that watches the sky will notice the patterns, and given enough time, they will learn to predict them. This is the consensus view among archaeologists and historians, and it is supported by the diversity of lunar myths and practices. Each culture has its own stories, its own rituals, its own calendar systems, but the similarities are also striking. The global focus on the 18.6-year cycle, the widespread use of the 19-year metonic cycle, the common description of eclipses as the moon being devoured, the repeated motif of sky teachers, beings who come and instruct. These similarities suggest connection, contact, or a shared heritage. One possibility is that the knowledge spread with human migration. As populations moved, they carried their knowledge with them. The peopling of the Americas, for instance, occurred at least 15,000 years ago, perhaps earlier. If the migrants already possessed lunar knowledge, they would have brought it with them. And as their descendants spread across the continents, the knowledge would have spread too, adapting to local conditions but retaining a common core. Another possibility is seafaring contact. Ancient mariners, navigating by the stars and the moon, could have traveled farther and earlier than we currently believe. The Polynesian navigators crossed the Pacific, but how early? And were there others in the Atlantic, in the Indian Ocean, who did the same? If knowledge was exchanged along these maritime routes, it could explain the similarities we see. A third possibility, more speculative but not dismissible, is that the knowledge originates from a single, now lost culture. A people who lived during or before the end of the Ice Age, who developed sophisticated astronomical practices, and who were displaced or destroyed by the climatic upheavals of that time. The survivors, scattered, carried fragments of the knowledge with them, which were then integrated into the emerging cultures of the Holocene, our current geological epoch. This is the lost civilization hypothesis, and it is controversial. But it is not baseless. The myths speak of such a time. The flood myths, the stories of golden ages, the tales of teachers from a lost land, they all point to this idea. We do not have definitive proof, but we have enough to ask the question. And the question itself is powerful. The moon's influence on Earth is not merely cultural or historical. It is physical, tangible, ongoing. The moon stabilizes Earth's axial tilt, which in turn stabilizes our climate. Without the moon, Earth's axis would wobble chaotically, leading to extreme climatic shifts that would make complex life difficult, perhaps impossible. The moon, in a very real sense, makes Earth habitable. It is not just a clock or a calendar. It is a guardian. This physical relationship, the gravitational dance between Earth and Moon, has existed for over 4 billion years, since shortly after Earth's formation. The prevailing theory is that the Moon was created when a Mars-sized body collided with the early Earth, and the debris coalesced to form the Moon. This violent birth has shaped both worlds. The Moon is slowly drifting away from Earth, at a rate of about 3.8 centimeters per year. In the distant past, it was closer. The tides were stronger, the days were shorter, and the moon loomed larger in the sky. Imagine the moon as it appeared to the earliest humans. Larger, brighter, more imposing. The tides it raised would have been dramatic, the coastal environments more dynamic. Early humans, living along these coasts, would have been even more attuned to the moon's cycles. The connection would have been immediate, visceral, impossible to ignore. And so, perhaps, the knowledge we see encoded in myth and monument is not just the product of intellectual curiosity. It is the product of necessity. The moon governed the environment in ways that were directly observable and directly consequential. To ignore it was to risk hunger, danger, death. To understand it was to gain power, the power to predict, to plan, to survive. This is why the lunar knowledge feels so urgent in the myths. It is not abstract. It is not philosophical. It is survival knowledge elevated to the sacred because it is essential. And when that knowledge is threatened by catastrophe, by migration, by cultural disruption, it must be preserved at all costs. And so it is carved into stone. It is woven into song. It is embedded in the names of gods and the structures of temples. It becomes the foundation of culture itself. Now think about the modern world. We have electric lights. We have clocks. We have calendars printed on paper and stored in phones. We do not need to watch the moon to know the time or the date. The moon has become decorative, aesthetic, romantic. We have, in a sense, forgotten our dependence on it. But the dependence remains. The tides still rise and fall. The climate is still stabilized. The moon is still there, still performing its ancient role. And yet, we are in danger of losing the knowledge again. Not the scientific knowledge that is well documented, stored in libraries and databases, but the cultural knowledge, the stories, the sense of connection, the understanding that we are not separate from the cosmos, but part of it, that the rhythms of the sky are our rhythms, that the moon, which has watched over humanity for hundreds of thousands of years, is not just an object, but a companion. The myths tried to preserve this. They said, remember, the moon is not just a light. It is a teacher. It is a keeper of cycles. It is a link to those who came before. And if we forget this, we lose something essential. We lose our place in the story. So what is the answer to the question we posed at the beginning? What if the moon's oldest myths record a human age? Before written history, the answer is, they do. Not in the way we might expect, not as literal factual accounts, but as encoded knowledge, as memories preserved in metaphor, as the residue of long observation and deep understanding. The myths are not fantasies. They are records, imperfect, distorted by time and retelling, but records nonetheless. And what do they record? They record a time when humans watched the sky with a clarity and a focus that we have only recently begun to reclaim. They record the knowledge of cycles, lunar, solar, stellar, that was essential to survival and sacred in its significance. They record the existence of teachers, of knowledge keepers, of those who passed the wisdom down. And they record the loss, the forgetting, the need to remember. This is not a closed question. It is an open one. The evidence is still emerging. New archaeological sites are discovered. New interpretations of old myths are proposed. New technologies allow us to see patterns we missed before. The field of archaeoastronomy is growing, and with it, our understanding of how ancient peoples engaged with the cosmos. But what we can say with increasing confidence is this: the history of human knowledge is deeper than we have acknowledged. The sophistication of ancient peoples is greater than we have given them credit for. And the moon, our silent companion, has been central to that history from the very beginning. If you have been listening, if you have followed this thread with us tonight, then you are part of that continuity. You are part of the long chain of watchers, of questioners, of those who look up and wonder. The moon does not care whether we notice it, but we care. We always have. And if we are wise, we always will. Look up tonight if the sky is clear. Look at the moon. See it not just as a light, but as a clock, a calendar, a teacher. See it as the ancients saw it, as a link to the past, a guide in the present, and a promise of continuity into the future. And ask yourself, what am I forgetting? What knowledge, what connection, what sense of place in the cosmos have I allowed to fade? The moon will not answer, but the question itself is the beginning of remembrance. And remembrance, as the myths tell us, is the path back to what was lost. Back to the knowledge that sleeps in stone and story, waiting for us to wake it once again. We must consider, now, the role of eclipse mythology more deeply. The eclipse is not merely a celestial event. It is a rupture, a breaking of the expected order. The moon, which should be full and bright, is darkened. The sun, which should dominate the day, is obscured. These are moments when the cosmos seems to malfunction, when the rules are suspended. And in those moments, the ancient mind saw meaning. The Chinese called the solar eclipse the eating of the sun, and attributed it to a celestial dragon. During an eclipse, drums were beaten and arrows were shot into the sky to frighten the dragon away. This was not superstition in the sense of ignorance. It was ritual, a collective response to a cosmic anomaly. And beneath the ritual was knowledge. The Chinese imperial astronomers could predict eclipses. They used the Saros cycle, the same cycle the Babylonians used. If an astronomer failed to predict an eclipse, the consequences could be severe, even execution. The knowledge was that important. It was tied to the legitimacy of the emperor, to the mandate of heaven. The cosmos and the state were one, and the astronomer was the intermediary. In India, the demon Rahu is said to swallow the moon during a lunar eclipse. But Rahu is not merely a monster. He is the north lunar node, the point where the moon's orbit crosses the ecliptic. The south node is Ketu. Together, Rahu and Ketu govern the eclipse cycle. The myth is astronomy. The demon is a mathematical point. But the story makes it memorable. It makes it teachable. It embeds the knowledge in narrative so that it survives. This is the genius of mythological thinking. It takes abstract concepts, nodes, cycles, orbital, mechanics, and gives them personality, drama, conflict. The story is easier to remember than the formula. The image is more vivid than the diagram. And so, the knowledge is preserved, passed down, even when the original context is lost. The myth survives. And encoded within the myth is the science. But there is something else in the eclipse myths, something darker. In many cultures, the eclipse is not just a natural event. It is a portent, a warning. It signals disaster, the fall of kings, the coming of war. This association is not arbitrary. Eclipses are rare, dramatic, and they break the pattern. In a world where pattern is order and order is life, the breaking of the pattern is deeply unsettling. It suggests that the cosmos is unstable, that the forces of chaos are near. And in a society where the king or the priest is responsible for maintaining cosmic order, through ritual, through sacrifice, through correct observance, an eclipse is a failure. It is proof that something has gone wrong. And so, the response is urgent. Rituals must be performed. Offerings must be made. The people must participate, must help restore the balance. And when the eclipse passes, when the moon or sun returns, it is a collective victory. Order has been restored. The dragon has been defeated. The demon has been appeased. The cosmos continues. This is not primitive thinking. It is sophisticated symbolic thought. It recognizes the eclipse as a natural event. The astronomers predict it, after all, but it interprets it within a larger framework of meaning. The cosmos is not just a machine. It is a living, sacred order. And humans have a role in that order. We are not passive observers. We are participants, co-creators, maintainers of the balance. This worldview has been lost in the modern West largely. We see the cosmos as mechanical, deterministic, indifferent. The eclipse is just an alignment of spheres. It has no meaning beyond the physical. And in many ways, this is liberating. We do not need to fear the dragon. We do not need to perform rituals. We can simply watch, calculate, appreciate the beauty. But we have also lost something. We have lost the sense of participation, of connection. The cosmos is no longer our cosmos. It is just space, vast and cold and empty. And we are here, tiny and insignificant and alone. The myths told us otherwise. They told us we mattered, that our actions, our observations, our rituals were part of the cosmic order, that the moon watched us as we watched it. Perhaps this is why the lunar myths still resonate, why they still draw us in, even in an age of science and technology, because they speak to something deeper than fact. They speak to relationship, to the bond between human and cosmos, between the watcher and the watched. And that bond, however we interpret it, is real. It is ancient. It is part of what makes us human. So when we read that the Babylonians tracked the moon for centuries, or that the Polynesians navigated by its light, or that the Maya calculated its cycles to the day, we are not just reading about astronomy. We are reading about a relationship, a long, deep, unbroken relationship between humanity and the moon, a relationship that predates history, that is recorded in myth, and that continues quietly even now. Every time you glance up and note the moon's phase, you are participating in that relationship. Every time you feel the pull of the tide, or the shift of the seasons, you are touched by the moon's influence. And every time you wonder about the cosmos, about our place in it, about the knowledge that was and the knowledge that might be, you are walking the same path the ancients walked. You are asking the same questions. You are, in a sense, remembering. And this is what the myths ask of us. Not to believe them literally, but to remember them. To let them remind us of the depth of time, the continuity of knowledge, the bond between human and sky. To see the moon not as a dead rock, but as a companion, a teacher, a keeper of cycles. To see ourselves not as isolated individuals, but as part of a long chain, stretching back into the darkness of prehistory and forward into an unknowable future. The moon will continue its dance. The question is, will we continue to watch? Will we continue to ask? Will we continue to remember? Let us turn, finally, to the question of what we have lost. Not just the knowledge, though that is significant, but the mode of knowing. The way ancient peoples engaged with the world, with the sky, with the cycles that govern their lives. This is not something we can fully recover. The world has changed too much. We have changed too much. But we can, perhaps, glimpse it. And in glimpsing it, we might find something valuable. Ancient knowledge was embodied. It was not abstract, not something written in a book and consulted occasionally. It was lived. The farmer knew the seasons not by reading a calendar, but by watching the land, the plants, the sky. The navigator knew the stars not by memorizing charts, but by sailing under them, by feeling the swell of the ocean, by watching the flight of birds. The knowledge was in the body, in the senses, in the rhythm of daily life. And the moon was part of that rhythm. Its phases governed the monthly cycle of festivals, of rituals, of work. The full moon was a time of light, of gathering, of celebration. The new moon was a time of darkness, of rest, of renewal. The waxing moon was a time of growth, of planting, of beginning. The waning moon was a time of harvesting, of completing, of letting go. This was not superstition. It was a way of organizing time that was natural, intuitive, aligned with observable reality. We have lost this. Our calendars are solar, divided into arbitrary months of varying lengths. Our weeks are 7 days, a remnant of Babylonian astrology, no longer tied to any celestial cycle. Our time is measured by clocks, precise to the second, indifferent to the sky. We can live our entire lives without ever noticing the moon's phase, without ever feeling its pull. And in many ways, this is progress. It frees us from the constraints of natural cycles. It allows us to work at night, to travel regardless of the tide, to plan years in advance with precision. But it also disconnects us. We no longer feel ourselves as part of the natural world. We are observers, users, controllers. We stand outside the cycles, not within them. And this disconnection has consequences. It affects how we see ourselves, how we see the world, how we make decisions. We have lost the embodied, intuitive understanding of time and place that our ancestors had. And with it, we have lost a certain kind of wisdom. The myths preserve that wisdom in a way. They remind us that there was another way of being in the world. A way that was slower, more attentive, more connected. A way that saw the moon not as a distant object, but as a presence, a guide, a companion. And they invite us to consider, what would it mean to reclaim some of that? Not to abandon modernity, but to integrate it with something older, something deeper. This is not a call to return to the past. We cannot go back, and we should not want to. The past was hard, often brutal, marked by suffering and limitation, but it also held knowledge we have lost. And that knowledge, if we can recover it, might help us navigate the future. Consider the environmental crisis we face today. Climate change, resource depletion, the collapse of ecosystems. These are, in many ways, the result of disconnection. We have treated the Earth as an object to be exploited, not as a living system of which we are a part. We have ignored the cycles, the seasons, the tides, the migrations that govern the natural world. We have acted as if we are separate, above, in control. And the consequences are becoming clear. The ancient peoples, for all their limitations, understood that they were part of the system. They watched the sky because their survival depended on it. They tracked the moon because it governed the tides, the seasons, the rhythms of life. They did not have the power to change the world on a global scale, and so they adapted to it. They learned to live within the cycles, not against them. We have the power to change the world, but we are learning, painfully, that power without wisdom is dangerous. And wisdom, in this context, means understanding the systems, respecting the cycles, recognizing our place within the larger whole. It means watching, listening, paying attention. It means, in a sense, remembering how to see the moon not just as a light in the sky, but as a part of the web of relationships that sustain life on Earth. The myths can teach us this, not by giving us answers, but by reminding us of questions. Not by telling us what to do, but by showing us what was done, what was known, what was preserved. They are a link to a different way of thinking, a different mode of knowledge. And that link, fragile as it is worth preserving. So when we ask, what if the moon's oldest myths record a human age before written history? We are not just asking about the past. We are asking about the present and the future. We are asking, what have we forgotten? What do we need to remember? What knowledge, what wisdom, what way of being in the world have we lost in our rush toward progress? And can we recover it, not as nostalgia, but as resource? As a tool for navigating the challenges ahead? The answer is not simple. It requires humility, a willingness to learn from the past without romanticizing it. It requires curiosity, a willingness to question the narratives we have been told. And it requires attention, a willingness to look up, to watch the sky, to feel the pull of the tides, to notice the cycles that continue, indifferent to human affairs. The moon is still there. It is still cycling through its phases. It is still pulling the oceans, stabilizing the climate, marking the passage of time. And the myths are still here, preserved in texts and oral traditions, waiting to be read, to be heard, to be understood. Not as literal history, but as encoded wisdom. As the memory of a relationship that has shaped humanity from the beginning. And if we are wise, we will listen. There is a moment, late at night, when the noise of the day has faded and the sky is clear, when you can stand outside and simply watch the moon. No agenda, no purpose, just watching. And in that moment, something shifts. The moon is no longer an object, a thing in the sky. It becomes a presence. You feel its light on your skin. You see the shadows it casts, sharp and clear. You notice its position relative to the horizon, the stars, the trees. You become aware that you are observing, and that the act of observation is itself a kind of participation. This is what the ancients knew. This is what the myths try to convey. The moon is not separate from us. It is part of our experience, our environment, our existence. To watch the moon is to connect with something vast and old and ongoing. It is to place yourself in a continuum that stretches back tens of thousands of years and forward into an unknowable future. And in that moment of watching, you might find yourself asking the same questions the ancients asked. Why does it change? Why does it move as it does? What governs its cycles? And in asking those questions, you are doing what humans have always done. You are seeking pattern, seeking order, seeking understanding. You are participating in the oldest science, the first astronomy, the original act of wondering. The myths tell us that this act of wondering is sacred. That to watch the sky is to engage with the divine, with the fundamental structure of reality, with the mystery at the heart of existence. And whether or not we frame it in religious terms, the insight is valid. There is something profound about looking up at the night sky and feeling small, insignificant, and yet also connected. Connected to the cosmos, to the long history of watchers, to the knowledge that has been passed down through generations. This is why the moon myths matter. Not because they are accurate in a literal scientific sense, but because they preserve an attitude, a relationship, a way of being in the world. They remind us that we are not the first to wonder, and we will not be the last. They remind us that knowledge is not just something we acquire, but something we inherit, something we carry forward, something we pass on. And they remind us that the story is not finished. The myths are still being told. The moon is still being watched. The knowledge is still accumulating. We are part of that story, whether we realize it or not. Every observation we make, every question we ask, every moment we spend looking up at the sky, we are adding to the great, ongoing conversation between humanity and the cosmos. So what does it mean to say that the moon's oldest myths record a human age before written history? It means that the conversation is older than we think, that the knowledge is deeper, that the connection is more fundamental. It means that we are not starting from scratch, not inventing the world anew, but continuing something that began long ago. And it means that the myths, for all their strangeness, for all their distance from our modern understanding, are not relics. They are living texts, still speaking, still teaching, still calling us to remember. Remember what? Remember that we are part of the cosmos, not separate from it. Remember that the cycles of the sky are our cycles, the rhythms of the moon are our rhythms. Remember that knowledge is not just facts and figures, but relationship, embodied understanding, a way of being attuned to the world. Remember that we are the inheritors of a long tradition, a chain of watchers and wanderers stretching back into the darkness of prehistory. And remember that we have a responsibility to that tradition, to preserve it, to honor it, to pass it on. This is not a burden. It is a gift. The myths give us a heritage, a depth, a sense of continuity. They tell us that we are not alone, not lost, not disconnected. They tell us that the path has been walked before, that the sky has been watched, that the knowledge has been preserved. And they invite us to take our place in that long lineage, to add our own observations, our own questions, our own insights. The moon will continue its journey, indifferent to whether we watch. But we are not indifferent. We watch, we wonder, we ask. And in asking, we become part of something larger than ourselves. We become part of the story of humanity and the moon, the story of the watchers and the watched, the story that began when the first human looked up and noticed the light in the sky and wondered what it meant. And that story is not over. It is still being written. Tonight, as you lie in bed, as the screen dims and sleep approaches, the moon is out there. It is moving through its phase, tracing its path across the sky, pulling the tides, stabilizing the earth, marking the passage of time. It is doing what it has always done. And somewhere, someone is watching. Someone is asking questions. Someone is remembering. Perhaps it is you. Perhaps, in listening to this, you have become one of the watchers. One of those who asks, who wonders, who seeks to understand. If so, then you are part of the tradition. You are part of the chain. And the myths, those ancient, strange, beautiful myths, are speaking to you. They are saying, remember. Remember the moon. Remember the cycles. Remember the knowledge. Remember the connection. And in remembering, you are doing more than preserving the past. You are creating the future. Because the knowledge we carry forward, the questions we ask, the attention we pay, these shape what comes next. They determine what we value, how we live, what we pass on to those who come after us. So look up, watch the moon, ask the questions, and know that in doing so, you are part of something ancient and ongoing and vital. You are part of the story that the myths have been telling for thousands of years. The story of humanity learning to see, learning to understand, learning to remember. The moon does not speak, but if we listen, truly listen, we can hear the echoes of all those who watched before us. And in those echoes, we can find guidance, wisdom, and the assurance that we are not alone. We never were. We never will be. The moon is our companion. The myths are our inheritance. And the journey continues. Let us end where we began, with a question. But now the question has deepened. What if the moon's oldest myths record a human age before written history? We have explored the evidence, the patterns, the alignments. We have traced the lunar calendars across cultures and continents. We have examined the myths of teachers and sky watchers, of floods and golden ages. We have considered the monuments, the mathematics, the multi-generational observations. And through it all, the moon has remained constant. A silent witness, a patient teacher, a keeper of cycles. The answer we now see is not a simple yes or no. It is both and more. Yes, the myths record something. They preserve knowledge, techniques, observations that stretch back into deep time. They are not merely stories, but encoded data, teaching tools, mnemonic devices. They carry the memory of a people who watched the sky with care and precision, who understood the cycles, who passed that understanding down through oral tradition until it was finally written and became what we call history. But they also record something deeper, something harder to quantify. They record a relationship, a way of seeing the world, a mode of knowledge that was embodied, intuitive, connected. The myths tell us that humanity did not suddenly become intelligent 5,000 years ago when writing was invented. We were intelligent long before. We were curious, observant, systematic. We were scientists in our own way. We watched the sky not because we had leisure, but because we had need. And the need drove the knowledge. And the knowledge became culture, became ritual, became myth. And so, when we ask what the myths record, we are asking about ourselves. About where we come from, about what we have forgotten, about what we might yet remember. We are asking about the depth of human history, the continuity of human thought, the resilience of human knowledge in the face of catastrophe and change. The moon, in this inquiry, is more than a celestial body. It is a symbol. It is the archive of our relationship with the cosmos. It is the constant against which our story unfolds. And the myths are the key to reading that archive. Not in a literal sense, the myths are not historical documents in the modern understanding. But in a deeper sense, they are the distillation of thousands of years of observation, of lived experience, of transmission from elder to child, from teacher to student, from one generation to the next. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information. We can look up the moon's phase in an instant, predict eclipses decades in advance, send machines to its surface. We know more about the moon in a technical sense than any previous generation. And yet, we are also more disconnected. The knowledge is external, stored in databases and textbooks. It is not part of our daily rhythm, not woven into our rituals and stories. We do not live by the moon's light. We have electric lamps. We do not track its phases for planting or hunting. We have industrial agriculture and supermarkets. The moon has become optional. But in becoming optional, it has also become invisible. We no longer see it, not really. We glance up occasionally, note whether it is full or crescent, and move on. We do not watch it night by night. We do not notice the slow shift of its rising and setting points. We do not feel the pull of its cycles. And in losing that connection, we have lost something essential. We have lost the sense that we are part of the cosmos, not separate from it. The myths can help us recover that sense. Not by providing answers, but by reminding us of the questions. Not by telling us what to believe, but by showing us what was valued, what was preserved, what was deemed worthy of transmission across the millennia. They tell us that the moon mattered, that the sky mattered, that the cycles mattered. And if they mattered then, in a world so different from ours, perhaps they still matter now. Perhaps, in fact, they matter more. Because we have the power now to disrupt those cycles on a planetary scale. We can change the climate, alter the composition of the atmosphere, reshape the surface of the Earth. We can, if we are not careful, break the systems that have sustained life for billions of years. And if we do, no amount of technological sophistication will save us. We need wisdom, not just knowledge. We need to understand that we are part of the web, not the masters of it. We need to remember what the ancients knew, that we are subject to the cycles, not above them. And the moon, the ancient companion, can teach us this. If we watch, if we pay attention, if we allow ourselves to feel the connection that our ancestors felt, not as superstition but as truth. The truth that we are small and the cosmos is vast, and we are part of something much larger than ourselves. This is the final message of the myths. Not that the moon is a god, or that eclipses are omens, or that sky teachers descended from the heavens, but that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, that the cosmos is our home, and the cycles are our inheritance, and the knowledge is our birthright, and that if we have the courage to look up, to watch, to wonder, we can reconnect with that inheritance. We can reclaim the wisdom that has been sleeping in stone and story, waiting for us to remember. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think of the moon. Think of all those who have watched it before you, the Paleolithic hunters marking its phases on bone, the Neolithic builders aligning their monuments to its standstills, the Sumerian scribes recording its cycles in cuneiform, the Polynesian navigators steering by its light, the Mayan astronomers calculating its eclipses. Think of the long chain of watchers, each adding their observations, each refining the knowledge, each passing it on. And know that you are part of that chain, that in listening to this story, in asking these questions, in allowing yourself to wonder, you are continuing the tradition. You are one of the watchers now. And the moon, silent and patient, continues its dance, waiting for you to see. There is a final layer to this inquiry, one that we have circled but not fully addressed. It is the question of consciousness, of memory, of what it means to know something, not just intellectually but existentially. The myths speak of remembrance, of restoration, of knowledge that was lost and found again. And this language, this insistence on memory rather than discovery, suggests something profound about how ancient peoples understood knowledge itself. Modern science is built on the idea of discovery. We uncover new truths, formulate new theories, expand the boundaries of what is known. The model is linear, progressive. We move from ignorance to knowledge, from darkness to light. This is a powerful framework, and it has driven tremendous advances. But it is not the only way to think about knowledge. The ancient model, as reflected in the myths, is cyclical. Knowledge is not discovered, but remembered. It was known once, in a golden age, and then it was lost, forgotten in a catastrophe or a fall. The task of the wise is not to invent, but to recover, to remember, to restore what was. This model resonates with certain psychological and spiritual traditions. The idea that we already know deep within the truths we seek. That learning is not acquisition, but uncovering. That wisdom is not external, but internal. Plato's theory of anamnesis, that learning is recollection of knowledge the soul possessed before birth, is one expression of this idea. The Vedic concept of the Atman, the inner self that is identical with Brahman, the cosmic self, is another. The idea that we are not separate from the cosmos but expressions of it, and that to know the cosmos is to know ourselves. This is not science in the modern sense. But it is not mere mysticism either. It is a framework for understanding the deep continuity between human consciousness and the structure of reality. The cycles we observe in the sky, the moon's phases, the sun's seasons, the stars' precession, are not separate from us. They are reflected in us, in the rhythms of our bodies, in the structure of our brains, in the patterns of our thoughts. We are made of the same atoms that make the stars. We are governed by the same laws. And so, to study the cosmos is, in a sense, to study ourselves. And to remember the cosmos is to remember who we are. The moon, in this framework, becomes a mirror. It reflects not just the sun's light, but our own nature. The cycles are our cycles. Its constancy is our constancy. Its changes are our changes. To watch the moon is to watch ourselves, our own rhythms, our own patterns, our own journey through time. And the myths, by encoding lunar knowledge in narrative form, are doing more than preserving data. They are preserving a way of seeing, a way of understanding the relationship between human and cosmos, a way of knowing that is not just intellectual but existential, that engages the whole person, body, mind, spirit, in the act of observation and understanding. We have, in the modern world, largely abandoned this holistic approach. We separate the intellectual from the emotional, the scientific from the spiritual, the observer from the observed. We treat knowledge as something external, something to be acquired and stored. And this has its advantages. It allows for specialization, for precision, for rapid advancement. But it also creates a kind of fragmentation. We know more and more about less and less. We lose sight of the whole. We lose the sense of connection, of participation, of being part of the story. The myths call us back to that wholeness. They remind us that knowledge is not just information. It is relationship. It is participation. It is a way of being in the world. And the moon, because it is so accessible, so constant, so intimately tied to our experience, is the perfect teacher of this way of knowing. You do not need a telescope to watch the moon. You do not need a textbook to understand its phases. You need only to look up night after night and pay attention, to notice the pattern, to feel the rhythm, to allow yourself to be drawn into the cycle. And in doing so, you are not just learning about the moon. You are learning about time, about change, about constancy. You are learning about yourself. This is what the ancients understood. This is what the myths preserve. Not just the technical knowledge of lunar cycles, but the experiential knowledge of what it means to be a being in time, subject to cycles, part of a larger order. And this knowledge, this way of knowing, is perhaps the most valuable thing the myths offer us. Not information, but wisdom. Not facts, but understanding. Not data, but meaning. And meaning is what we crave. In an age of information overload, of constant distraction, of endless noise, we hunger for meaning, for connection, for a sense that our lives are part of something larger, something coherent, something that matters. The myths provide that. They tell us that we are not isolated individuals adrift in a meaningless universe. We are part of a story that began long ago and continues still. We are the inheritors of knowledge passed down through countless generations. We are the watchers of the sky, the keepers of the cycles, the stewards of memory. And the moon, the ancient companion, is our guide. It does not tell us what to do. It does not provide easy answers. But it offers a presence, a constancy, a reminder that we are not alone, that the cycles continue, that the patterns hold, that there is order even in the midst of chaos, and that if we watch, if we pay attention, if we allow ourselves to remember, we can find our place in that order. This is the gift of the myths. This is the message they carry across the millennia. Not a message of certainty, but of connection. Not a promise of answers, but an invitation to participate, to watch, to wonder, to remember, and in remembering, to become who we have always been, the watchers of the moon, the children of the cosmos, the keepers of the ancient knowledge. Not because we are special, but because we are human. And this is what humans do. We watch the sky. We ask questions. We pass the knowledge down. We tell stories. We remember. The moon is there waiting. The myths are here speaking. And the question remains open and alive. What if the oldest myths record a human age before written history? What if they are calling us, even now, to remember something we have forgotten? Something essential, something profound, something that might yet save us? Listen. Now let us imagine a scene. It is 10,000 years ago. The ice sheets are retreating. The climate is warming. The great herds are migrating north, following the grasslands as they spread. And a group of humans, your ancestors, our ancestors, stand on a coastal plain that will one day be underwater. They do not know this. They know only that the land is generous, that the shellfish are abundant, that the fish run thick in the rivers. They have lived here for generations. They know every rock, every tree, every turn of the tide. And above them, the moon, larger than it appears to you now because it was closer then, brighter, more imposing. Every night it rises. Every night it changes. And they watch. They mark the days. They know, with a precision born of necessity, when the tide will be low, when the fish will spawn, when the shellfish will be easiest to gather. This knowledge is not written. Cannot be. There is no writing. But it is known. It is carried in memory, in ritual, in the teaching of elders to children. And then, one generation, the sea begins to rise. Slowly at first, then faster. The plain floods. The settlements are abandoned. The people move inland to higher ground. And they carry their knowledge with them. The knowledge of the moon. The knowledge of the tides. The knowledge of the cycles. They teach it to the people they meet, the inland tribes who have been watching the sky for different reasons, for different needs. And the knowledge mingles, adapts, evolves. Centuries pass. Millennia. The coastal plain is now 40 meters underwater. The settlements are drowned. The bones of the watchers lie beneath the waves. But the knowledge survives. It is in the songs. It is in the rituals. It is in the alignment of the stones that the descendants build, far inland, to mark the rising of the moon. And one day, much later, someone presses a stylus into clay and writes it down. And we, reading that clay tablet 5,000 years later, call it the beginning of astronomy. But it is not the beginning. It is a continuation, a preservation, a translation of something much older. This is not a fantasy. This is, increasingly, what the evidence suggests. The sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age drowned vast stretches of coastline where humans lived. The archaeology of those drowned lands is only beginning to be explored. And what we find, the submerged settlements, the stone tools, the middens, tells us that these were not primitive peoples. They were sophisticated, adapted, knowledgeable. And some of that knowledge, we can infer, must have been astronomical. Because the coast, more than any other environment, demands lunar knowledge. The tides govern everything, and the tides are governed by the moon. And so, the myths of a flood, of a lost age, of teachers who came from the sea or survived the waters, these may not be pure invention. They may be memory, distorted, mythologized, but memory nonetheless. Memory of a time when the coasts were rich and populous, when knowledge flourished, and when that world was drowned. And the survivors, carrying what they could, moved inland and passed the knowledge on. This is why the lunar knowledge appears so suddenly and so fully formed in the early civilizations. It did not develop in Sumer or Egypt. It arrived there brought by migrants, traders, survivors. It was integrated into the emerging urban cultures, written down, systematized. But its roots go deeper, much deeper, into the Neolithic, into the Paleolithic, into the time before the flood. And the myths remember. They insist on it. They say, we were taught. There was a before. There were those who knew. And we are the inheritors, the preservers, the continuers of their work. This is not to claim a single, lost supercivilization. The evidence does not support that. But it does support something more subtle and more profound. A network of knowledge, carried by oral tradition, adapted to local conditions, but sharing a common core. A core of sky watching, of cycle tracking, of understanding the relationship between the heavens and the earth. A core that is old, far older than the written record, and that was sophisticated in ways we are only beginning to appreciate. And the moon was central to that core. Not because it was worshipped, though it often was. Not because it was mysterious, though it must have seemed so. But because it was useful. It was the clock, the calendar, the predictor of tides and seasons. It was the first and most accessible astronomical object. And mastering it meant survival. And survival knowledge, elevated to the sacred, encoded in myth, became the foundation of culture. So when we ask, what if the moon's oldest myths record a human age before written history, we are not asking an abstract question. We are asking about real people with real knowledge, facing real challenges. People who watched the sky because their lives depended on it. People who passed that knowledge down because it was too valuable to lose. People who, when disaster struck, when the floods came, when their world ended, did everything they could to preserve what they knew. They told stories. They built monuments. They taught the young. They insisted, remember, and we, thousands of years later, are the recipients of that insistence. The myths are their message to us. The monuments are their legacy. And the knowledge, however fragmentary, however distorted by time, is still here, still accessible, still waiting for us to recognize it, to honor it, to learn from it. We are not separate from those ancient watchers. We are their descendants. Their blood runs in our veins. Their genes shape our bodies. And their knowledge, encoded in our culture, in our language, in our stories, is part of our inheritance. We are the continuation of their project. And the moon, unchanging, indifferent, continues to mark the passage of time, continues to pull the tides, continues to govern the cycles. It is still there, still teaching, still waiting for us to watch. There is a paradox at the heart of this inquiry. The more we learn about ancient peoples, the more sophisticated they appear. The more we examine the myths, the more knowledge we find encoded within them. And yet, the more sophisticated they are revealed to be, the more unsettling the question becomes, why did we forget? Why did the knowledge have to be rediscovered? Why did the chain break? The answer, as we have touched on, is catastrophe. But not a single catastrophe. A series of them. The Younger Dryas, a sudden return to Ice Age conditions around 12,000 years ago, lasting a millennium. The floods that followed as the ice melted and the seas rose. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, when multiple civilizations across the Mediterranean and Near East collapsed simultaneously, perhaps due to climate change, invasion, or systems failure. The Library of Alexandria, burning over centuries. The fall of Rome and the loss of much classical knowledge in Europe. The burning of the Mayan codices. The suppression of indigenous oral traditions worldwide during colonization. Each of these events erased knowledge. Each broke the chain of transmission. And each time, the survivors had to rebuild from what remained. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they remembered enough to reconstruct the calendars, to realign the monuments, to retell the stories. But sometimes they did not. Sometimes the knowledge was lost entirely, and future generations had to start over, to rediscover what was once known. This is the tragedy of history. Knowledge is fragile. It requires continuous transmission, continuous teaching, continuous practice. If the chain is broken by war, by plague, by climate disaster, by cultural suppression, the knowledge fades. It becomes garbled, transformed into myth, eventually forgotten. And then, centuries or millennia later, someone stumbles upon a fragment, a tablet, a monument, a story, and realizes. They knew. Once, long ago, they knew. This is why the myths matter so much. They are the fragments that survived. They are the threads that connect us to the knowledge of the ancients. They are, in many cases, all we have. The monuments can be destroyed. The tablets can be broken. The books can be burned. But stories, if they are told, if they are valued, can survive almost anything. They adapt, they change, but the core persists. And that core, however distorted, is a lifeline to the past. And so, when we read the lunar myths, the stories of Thoth and Sin and Selene, of Rahu and Quetzalcoatl and the Polynesian navigators, we are not just reading stories. We are touching the knowledge of the ancients. We are hearing their voices, however faint, across the expanse of time. And we are being invited to remember to reclaim, to continue their work. This is not ancestor worship. It is recognition. Recognition that we are not the first to ask these questions, not the first to watch the sky, not the first to seek understanding. And that the work they did, the centuries of observation, the generations of teaching, the careful preservation of knowledge, that work is part of our foundation. It is the soil from which our science grew. And if we forget that, if we dismiss the myths as primitive, if we ignore the monuments as coincidence, we lose something essential. We lose our connection to the deep past. We lose the humility that comes from recognizing that we stand on the shoulders of countless generations. And we lose the wisdom that the myths encode, the wisdom of patience, of attention, of living in relationship with the cycles of the cosmos. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we honor it? How do we continue the work? First, we pay attention. We look up. We watch the moon. We notice its phases, its movements, its presence. We allow ourselves to feel the connection that our ancestors felt, not as superstition but as reality. The moon is there. It influences our world, and we are part of that world. Second, we preserve. We tell the stories. We study the myths not to debunk them, but to understand them. We protect the monuments, the texts, the oral traditions that have survived. We recognize them as precious, as irreplaceable, as part of the heritage of all humanity. Third, we transmit. We teach the next generation. We share the knowledge, the wonder, the sense of connection. We pass on not just the facts that the moon orbits Earth, that eclipses follow a cycle, but the meaning, the understanding that we are part of a long story, that the cosmos is our home, that the cycles are our rhythm. And finally, we ask questions. We remain curious. We do not assume that we know everything, that the past is settled, that the mysteries are solved. We approach the ancient with humility and wonder. We allow for the possibility that they knew things we have forgotten. We seek to learn from them, not just about them. This is the attitude that the myths invite. Not certainty but curiosity. Not conquest but relationship. Not dominance but participation. And in that attitude there is hope. Hope that we can recover some of what was lost. Hope that we can avoid the catastrophes that broke the chain before. Hope that we can build a future that honors the past, that preserves the knowledge, that passes the torch to those who come after. The moon will continue its journey. The cycles will continue. The question is, will we continue to watch? Will we continue to ask? Will we continue to remember? The answer depends on us. On you. On whether you choose to look up tonight, to notice the moon, to feel the connection. On whether you choose to value the myths, to study the past, to preserve the knowledge. On whether you choose to teach, to share, to pass it on. The ancient watchers are gone, but their work remains, and it is now ours to continue. Not because we must, but because we can. Because the knowledge is still here, still accessible, still waiting for us to recognize it. Because the moon is still there, still teaching, still calling us to watch. And because, in the end, we are the same. We are the watchers. We are the wanderers. We are the keepers of memory. And the story, the long, deep, ancient story of humanity and the moon, is still being written. And so, we arrive at the end of this journey. But it is not truly an end. It is a pause, a moment of reflection before the watching continues. We have traveled through time tonight, from the Ice Age to the present, from the first marks on bone to the spacecraft that have touched the lunar surface. We have walked with the Babylonians and the Maya, the Egyptians and the Polynesians. We have stood before the monuments and read the myths. We have asked the question, what if the moon's oldest myths record a human age before written history? And we have found, not a single answer, but a constellation of insights, a web of connections, a deepening of the mystery. The myths do record something. They record knowledge, observation, relationship. They record a time when humans watched the sky with patience and care, when the moon was not a distant object but a living presence, when knowledge was not external but embodied. They record the work of countless generations, the slow accumulation of understanding, the careful transmission from elder to child. And they record the loss, the catastrophe, the forgetting that came when civilizations fell and the chain was broken. But they also record hope. They record the persistence of knowledge, the resilience of memory, the determination to preserve. They record the belief that what was lost can be found, that what was forgotten can be remembered, that the work can continue. And they record the invitation to us here now to take our place in the story, to become the watchers, to continue the work. This is not a call to return to the past. We cannot go back. The world has changed too much. We have changed too much. But it is a call to integrate the past with the present, to honor the deep continuity of human knowledge, to recognize that we are part of a story that is far older and far deeper than we usually acknowledge. It is a call to see the moon not just as an object of scientific study, but as a companion, a teacher, a link to the ancestors who watched before us. And it is a call to wonder, to remain curious, to keep asking questions, to not settle for easy answers or comfortable narratives, to be willing to challenge what we think we know, to explore the mysteries, to follow the threads wherever they lead. Because the story is not finished. The knowledge is not complete. The cosmos still holds secrets, and the past still has lessons to teach. The moon, in this inquiry, has been our guide. But it is more than that. It is a symbol of constancy in a world of change, of order in a cosmos of chaos, of connection in an age of fragmentation. It is the reminder that the cycles continue, that the patterns hold, that there is something larger than ourselves, something that endures. And the myths, those ancient, strange, beautiful myths, are the message. They are the voice of the ancestors, calling across the millennia. Remember. Remember the moon. Remember the cycles. Remember the knowledge. Remember who you are. You are the watchers. You are the wanderers. You are the keepers of the ancient knowledge. And the work is yours now. The watching is yours. The remembering is yours. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, as the words fade and the silence deepens, let the moon rise in your mind. See it hanging there, cold and bright, marking the passage of time. Feel the pull of its gravity, the rhythm of its cycles, the presence of its light. And know that you are part of a story that began long ago and continues still. A story of watching and wondering, of learning and forgetting, of losing and finding. And know that the story is not written in ink or carved in stone. It is written in the sky, in the slow dance of the moon and earth and Sunday. And it is written in you, in your curiosity, in your questions, in your willingness to look up and pay attention. You are the continuation of the story. You are the inheritor of the knowledge. You are the watcher. The myths do not demand belief. They demand attention. They demand that we look, that we listen, that we remember. And in remembering, that we continue, that we watch, that we wonder, that we pass it on. This is the final message, the final invitation. Look up. Watch the moon. Ask the questions. Honor the ancestors who watched before you. Teach those who will watch after you. And know that in doing so, you are part of something vast and ancient and ongoing. You are part of the story of humanity and the cosmos. You are part of the great chain of watchers, stretching back into the darkness of prehistory and forward into the unknown future. The moon is there. The myths are here. And the question remains, alive and open. What have we forgotten? What do we need to remember? What knowledge, what wisdom, what way of being in the world have we lost and can we reclaim? The answer is waiting. Not in a book, not in a lecture, but in the act of watching. In the moment of attention. In the choice to look up and see. The moon has been teaching for thousands of years. It is still teaching now. The question is, are we still learning? If you are listening to this, if you have traveled with us through this long night of questions and stories and wonder, then you are learning. You are watching. You are remembering. And in doing so, you are honoring the ancient watchers, the keepers of the cycles, the ancestors who insisted, do not forget. Do not lose this. This is who we are. This is what we know. This is our gift to you. And so we pass the gift forward. We tell the story. We watch the moon. We remember. And we invite you once more to do the same. To look up. To wonder. To ask. To remember. The moon is waiting. The story continues, and you are part of it. Sleep well, traveler. And when you wake, look for the moon. It will be there, as it has always been, marking the passage of time, calling us to watch, to wonder, to remember. Remember,